Okay. So the title of this week's sheet is the famous answer to the question, what did the farmer with 3 holes in his backyard used to say? So the answer is well. But okay, so so I couldn't resist the old that old terrible joke, but it's hard to debate the fact that throughout Sefer Breshit and the rest of Tanakh as well, but mostly Sefer Breshit, the idea of wells are extremely important, and it comes as no surprise because we do live in an area here in Eretz Yisrael which has very limited water resources. It's a brand new thing. It's easy. It's easy to complain about Bibi, especially over the last couple of years when he didn't seem as politically attractive as he once was. But during his time, a couple of amazing things happened. One of them, of course, was he was the architect of startup.
Oh, now what's happened? Michael, it stopped.
Yeah,
It's frozen.
he's frozen.
It's frozen.
No, it's not you. It's not you, Mike. It's Rabbi Walk.
Oh, right. Okay.
Something's gone wrong with his thing.
Okay. So I just restarted the recording because I actually got disconnected for some reason. I hope everything is okay. But I am going to ask again if people could please mute themselves. And on chat, I've got you're frozen, yes. And I know, and I don't know what the problem was, but thank God things are back. Okay, so we're talking about wells. So in pre-modern Medinat Israel, water was always a tremendous issue. And so that the wells and the use of wells was always a very, very big deal. And it wasn't just that the place where you went for water, but because everybody had to go there for water, this became a place where people would meet. We saw in the time of David HaMelech, a war broke out, over a pool, in southern Israel, and we see in the time of Gidon that the test of who'd be in his army took place again by a pool in the Shomron, and so it's not a surprise that Eliezer, the servant of Avram Avinu, finds Rivka for Yitzchak at a well. And it's not surprising that a well is a major factor in this week's Parsha as well. So let's take a look at the introduction of the well. Here we go. V'yar. So Yaakov Avinu has just had the dream, and it makes it sound like very quickly after the dream, poof, he's in Haran. He's way, something like 700 kilometers, like 500 miles further north. The Midrash actually says that he stopped for a 20-year period, from the time of the dream till the story picks up, till the story resumes. Others say that no, it happened very quickly on a more pshat level. But anyways, he finally, after whatever amount of time it takes, arrives at Haran, at this place where the family came from, which is near the Euphrates River in in northern Syria today, almost up at the Turkish border. And he looks, v'hinei, lo and behold. Hinei always means that something unexpected happened. And he says there's a be'er in the Sadeh. Now, there are different words for water sources in Tanakh. A be'er is an old-fashioned well. My translation actually just says well. Other places say fountain, but a be'er is an old-fashioned well. Sometimes you'll have the term bore. That's a cistern. That's the water was gathered there from other places. Either it flowed into it or rainwater was gathered there, or sometimes there's a mayan. Mayan is the best. Mayan is actually flowing water and probably should be translated as either a spring or a fountain. But here we've got an old-fashioned well, okay? You've got water, groundwater in the ground, and then around this well in this field are 3 flocks of sheep, which are rovtzim, which are sort of like lazing around. I have lying. Rovates means more like to crouch. The idea of crouching gives this picture of they're ready to move towards the water. You get this impression that these sheep have been waiting for a long time to get some of this life-giving water. Ki min ha'be'er hahu yashkua adarim, because they water these flocks from the water in this well. The ha'even gedola al pi ha'be'er, and there is a large rock over the mouth of the well. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about what's going on with this rock. So we've got the 2 images that we have to really talk about, the rock and the well. And we're going to talk, actually, we're going to hopefully get to both of them. And then finally, a few verses later, it says that V'nesvu shama kol ha'adarim, all the flocks used to gather there, ugalu at the even me'al pi ha'be'er, and it took all of the shepherds to roll this massive rock from on top of the well. V'yishku et zaton, v'ashivu et even al pi ha'be'er l'mekoma, and after they finished, they'd put the rock back. But we know what happens. In just a few verses from here, Yaakov by himself is going to roll this big rock. We're going to have this act of like, Superman or Hercules, that he's going to behave like a superhero and roll this massive rock off of the well. So what's going on here? So let's start to look at some of the commentaries and get different viewpoints on what's happening here before I share a couple of my own ideas. So one of the most literal-minded of the medieval authorities, one of the Rishonim on the text, is the Chizkuni. And the Chizkuni, writing in the 13th century, writes, when he looked, see, there's a well in the field. The whole paragraph, up to and including the line, he rolled the rock aside, in verse 10, we're only at the beginning of the chapter, has been recorded only in order to teach us about the physical strength of Yaakov. Wow. In other words, there wasn't any miracle here. Yaakov really, over the past decades, since he was a scrawny 97-pound weakling, has turned into a very strong, a very strong physical presence. That's fine. I mean, nothing wrong with it. And later, when we're going to see in next week's parsha, when he encounters Esav, even though he's afraid, he can stand up to him, and Esav is himself going to be impressed by the physical stature of Yaakov Avinu. Okay, fine. That we talked about him last week as a yeshiva bacher, right? Yoshev Ohalim. This week he's he's a prize shepherd of tremendous physical strength and stamina. Okay, the Or HaChaim, writing a couple of centuries later than the Chizkuni, in the 1700s, writes, and the stone on top of the well was a massive one. Now, the reason the Or HaChaim states it this way, and the reason I sort of translate it that way, if you look at the verse way in the first line at the top of the page, it says, V'ha-even, the stone. It's got that hey hayadiyah on the stone. So the Or HaChaim is trying to let us know that hey, the stone, means it was like a famous stone of tremendous proportion and size. So based upon that, he goes on to say, if the Torah had not written the letter hey hayadiyah in the front of the word Evan, the impression created would have been that there was a heavy stone on top of the well. As it is, the Torah emphasizes the exceptional heaviness of this stone. This teaches us that unless Jacob had divine assistance, he could not have moved the stone. Aha! So in other words, the Chizkuni, writing in the 13th century, and the Or HaChaim, writing in the 18th century, totally disagree with one another. The Chizkuni wants us to know Yaakov was a weightlifter, and he was able to roll it off. And the Or HaChaim says, no. He stayed a 97-pound weakling. It was all a miracle, his ability to roll. I don't know which one is the correct approach, but it's interesting that we've got both. But as we move through the Meforshim, we're going to see a lot of symbolism going on here. Let's take a look at the first of two Rambans we're going to take a look at. The Ramban, again, writing in the 13th century. For the well alludes to the sanctuary. Sanctuary means the Beit HaMikdash. And the 3 flocks of sheep are symbolic of the pilgrims ascending to the sanctuary during the 3 festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The Ramban is telling us the metaphor of the well is based upon the fact that there are 3 flocks. Now that you might have read the verse and come to the conclusion, there just happened to have been at this time at 2:00 in the afternoon, 3 flocks hanging around. But the Ramban saying, no. Everything about this tableau, and think of it as like a snapshot in time. You've got this well, massive rock, 3 groups of sheep, that everything in this picture stands for something which alludes to the future of the Jewish people. The Ramban studies the entire book of Breshit on the premise called Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. Whatever happened to the patriarchs, and of course matriarchs, are all recorded because whatever happened to them is going to be indicative of what's going to happen to Klal Yisrael throughout the ages. So the well, a source of life, is the Beit HaMikdash. The well is a source of physical life. The Beit HaMikdash is a source of spiritual life. And the three flocks around it represent the 3 times a year that we would go to the Beit HaMikdash to have our spiritual batteries recharged. The expression, for out of that well they watered the flocks, alludes them now in the 3rd line in the Ramban, alludes to the fact that they drew holy inspiration from the pilgrimages to the sanctuary. Why did the Jews go to Yerushalayim 3 times a year? That it was those visits to Yerushalayim that recharged them spiritually. to make it through the year. It may be just like water revives a parched body, so too the Beit HaMikdash revives spiritually the human body, the soul. It may be that it alludes to the verse, for out of Zion shall go forth Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Thus both prophecy and law emanated from the sanctuary, which was likened to water. Torah and the Beit HaMikdash are often compared to water, life-giving water. Thus, both prophecy and law emanated from the sanctuary, and thither and to there were all the flocks gathered from verse 3 here. From the entrance of Hamot unto the brook of Egypt, the verse refers to the gathering of pilgrims for the festival of Sukkot, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered, in verse 3 here, for they drew holy inspiration, not water, but inspiration from the Beit HaMikdash. And they put the stone back in verse 3 here to lie dormant until the next festival. So in other words, rolling the stone back on was also like retreating from Yerushalayim to go back to our villages, wherever they may be. So the Ramban says that this entire scenario is to remind us of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, the Ramban says this earlier in our parsha, because earlier in our parsha, we've got the story about the ladder and the dream and the angels going up and down. The Ramban also said that was the Beit HaMikdash. So in other words, according to the Ramban, many of the images in the life of Yaakov Avinu were reminiscent, I shouldn't say reminiscent, excuse me, they were harbingers of a future reality for the Jewish nation in Eretz Israel, specifically in Yerushalayim, Ira Kodesh, together with the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. So that's the Ramban. We're going to see another Ramban on the backside in about 20 minutes or so. Okay. Rabbeinu Bechaya, who lived generation after the Ramban and considered himself a student of the Ramban, even though we're not sure he actually met him. He died in 1340. So Rabbeinu Bechaya wrote, he looked, and behold, look, hey, there's a well. Look at this water. See the water? Every single one of our patriarchs had an encounter with a well. And in each case, the well was an allusion to future happenings. Really? Where did Yaakov encounter a well? So there's a midrash. The midrash says that when they were going down to Egypt, the pasuk says, Avram Avinu noticed that Sarah was beautiful. So the midrash says that when he saw that Sarah was beautiful, he never looked at Sarah. Interesting relationship, not going there. That what happened was they were looking at some source of water. And when they looked in the water, he saw her reflection next to him. And he said to himself, wow, what a beautiful woman. And that was Sarah. I'm not advocating for this particular position. I'm just saying that the midrash provides the well scenario for Avram, even though it doesn't appear in the psukim. Okay, back to Rabbeinu Bechaya. In Yitzchak's case, the well he encountered was called Be'er Mayim Chayim. It was a well of living water. And he came back from that when he davened there, and that's when he met Rivka. He explains that to the Jewish people, Torah is equivalent to spring water. Torah is like living water, water which flows, as opposed to just a well. In a well, the water is stagnant. In a Be'er Mayim Chayim, it's more like an artesian well where the water is sprouting and flowing. Israel is called Sono Shel Makom, and the Jewish people, ourselves, we're called God's flock. The flock of God, as we know from Yechezkel, Atem, Tzono, Tzon, Marito, Adam, Atem. Okay, you are my sheep, sheep are my pasture. We have another pasuk, V'anachnu Amcha Tzon Maritecha, and we are your nation, the flock which you pasture, feed. Okay, and we're your people in the flock of your pasture. The reason the Torah mentioned 3 flocks, again, why 3 flocks? Because that the Jewish people consist of 3 flocks. So there are 3 flocks because they represent the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the Yisraelim. So that what's happening here is that this, it has, it's not like the Ramban where the 3 flocks represent the 3 times we visit the wellspring of spirituality called the Beit HaMikdash. Instead represents the Jewish nation, which is itself the wellspring of Torah and life for the world. And there are 3 sections to the Jewish nation. Okay, let's jump down to the bottom of the page, the Rashbam. Rashbam, of course, is Rashi's grandson. And he was a tremendous stickler for literal translations of the text. He didn't hold much by midrashim, by allegories. To him, stick to the letter in front of you and interpret it exactly. So he says again, ha'even gedolah, the very big stone, the great stone. This was a precautionary measure. So the Rashbam, I should have really done this before. I forgot I had put it down here. Okay, was a precautionary measure to ensure people would not fall into the well. So in other words, he wants to explain why they had this massive rock on it, and it was because of OSHA. It was because of a government regulation to make sure that people didn't fall into the well. So this idea that communities had to worry about, human stupidity has been with us for a long time. Actually, it's a Gemara as well. The Gemara, when we have that law that you have to build a ma'akah, a railing around flat roofs, the Mishnah and it's paskin in the Shulchan Aruch and by the Rambam that if you have an open public well, you have to put a railing or fence or wall around it of a minimum of a sarat tfachim, which is about 1 meter, about 40 inches, depending upon your measuring system. Okay. Or that they would not draw water from it, that they were not entitled. So he also gives the practical consideration we talked about before, that you wanted all of the shepherds to be there to make sure that no one was cheating on the allotment of water. Water was a tremendously valuable commodity and had to be metered very, very carefully. So the way they metered the water was this rock required all of them to be there. So everyone could keep an eye on everybody else until, Yaakov, AKA Superman, came and rolled the rock off. Okay. This is the last comment on our scenario. The Ramban at the bottom we're going to talk about a slightly different aspect of wells that we'll get to in a few minutes. The Kedushat Levi, who is Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, one of the most famous students of the Maggid of Mezrich. So he's from the 3rd generation of Hasidic masters, a contemporary of Rebbe Nachman of the Balatanya, who was active at the tail end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. So Reb Levi Yitzchak says, it appears best to explain this whole sequence allegorically. I think that, sometimes the literal scene doesn't describe what the Torah really wants to say. I'm sorry, there's somebody sent a note, or they together could roll the rock away. Yaakov didn't turn up every time. They needed to want, right? They had to do it together. But the idea is that they had to, without, muscles Yaakov there, without, or miraculous Yaakov, they needed all of them to do it. And that also made sure that nobody stole any water, which was a major, major concern. And, and also would stop some wayfarer from just coming and taking some of their water. He had to be there when everyone was there, and they had to agree to give it to him or perhaps sell it to him. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you look at the walled communities, both along the coast, where there was a coastal road leading from Egypt all the way to Mesopotamia, and throughout the Jordan Valley, when you found these ancient walled communities, they all were near wells. And so that when the caravans traveled, they would stop at these walled communities, and the walled communities were protecting water. The world's first walled city, approximately 8,000 BCE, which is a couple of thousand years before creation in the count that gives us 5782, but we're not going to get into that. As far as we can tell, the world's oldest walled city, according to archaeologists, is Jericho, Yericho. And the reason they needed to put walls there is because they had water. They had 7 oases, 7 sources of water in this major oasis called Jericho, and they walled it in to stop people from taking their water unless they paid for it. And so that was the first cause for building a wall that we know of in human history. Okay. So we're saying the whole thing is a metaphor. It's allegorical. It is a given that God, on his part, is desirous to make available to his creatures an uninterrupted flow of his largesse. Poteach et yadecha umasbir l'chol chai ratzon. God opens his metaphoric hands and provides the needs of all humanity, of all living things. And so the uninterrupted flow of God's largesse here means the water of the well. Especially, he wanted water to be available to the Jewish people, the people of Israel. Third line, however, from time to time, he appears to face interference from the left side of the sphere diagram. Now this, my wife and I always get upset about this. This is one of those anti-left-handed people Torahs, that when you look at the arrangement of the 10 sphirot, and I've showed you this picture before last year, it'll come up again. It's arranged like a grid where there's a middle line and there's a left side and a right side. On the right side starts with chesed, kindness. On the left side starts with gevura and din, justice and power. So the left side, kaviyachol, as if God had hands, the left hand of God represents judgment and punishment and strength and power, as opposed to the right hand of God represents kindness and encouragement okay, what can I tell you? And Yaakov is the one in the middle. Tiferet, he is the synthesis of both sides. But okay, so God's always giving, except when the left or judgment or negative side predominates. The only time when God does not encounter such interference is when the Jewish people are awakened by feelings of joy. So in other words, that the left side, the side of judgment and power, stops joy in the world whenever the Jewish people are not Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, are not worshiping God with tremendous joy. And this joy succeeds in repulsing any of this interference from the negative or left-hand side of the scenario. This is the image that opened up before Yaakov's eyes when he described V'yar v'hinei be'er. So it says he looked, and behold, there's a well. So according to the Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, that he looked and behold meant he had this huge prophetic vision of how God functions in the world, that his view of the well was similar to his dream of the ladder. He was seeing all sorts of celestial realities about our world. And he looks at it and he goes, wow, God is sending me a sign. And this is what this well means. This is the image that opened up before Yaakov's eyes when it described this as V'yar. And he saw, behold, something surprising, a well. He saw the fountain of God's largesse primed to water the field of the world. The word sadeh, commonly translated as field, is also a simile for chakel tepuchin kadishin, the holy apple orchard. Now, what's the holy apple orchard? The holy apple orchard is where the Ari used to take his Hasidim to accept Shabbos every Friday night. And it's not a real apple orchard, it's a symbolic orchard representing accepting all of God's bounty onto the world. And they would sing and they would dance there. And the joy that they showed accepting Shabbos opened up the apples or the well or the flow of God's bounty. A concept described in the Zohar, okay, we're not going there, describing 3 layers of different degrees of holiness in the celestial fields that are opposite the surrounding the Be'er. So there are around the Be'er 3 different levels of Kedusha. Whoa! What are those 3 different levels of Kedusha? Those 3 levels of holiness, sanctity, Kedusha, are the 3 different flocks. Okay, the great rock preventing access to the water from the well described is a simile for the powers of Satan. So, in other words, according to the Rebbe, Yaakov Avinu is on his merry way, marching up to the ancestral home in Haran, and he sees this scene and he says, wow, the water represents God's Poteach et yadecha, God's largesse. The 3 flocks represent the 3 levels of Kedusha. But there's the Satan, the Sitra Achra, the bad side, the left side, that's coming in to spoil the picture. And that is that rock preventing us from getting to the life-giving water. So now he feels this tremendous surge of spiritual power, and he just rolls the rock off the well, providing the world with all of its spiritual needs. Here's the problem of Reb Levi. Reb Levi Yitzchak doesn't want the well to just be water. In other words, it's sort of like, everything in psychology. Everything in psychology is a symbol. Oh, you dreamed what? That means this and that means the other thing. So that's the way Reb Levi Yitzchak wants this journey of Yaakov to be. It's not just a journey. It's a voyage of discovery to find out all of the spiritual secrets of our world. And so the well with the rock on it is that big secret that Yaakov has to roll off the well and reveal the secret to all of us. And so according to Rabbi Yitzchak, that's what's going on with our particular case of the well. Okay. I want to go back to last week's Parsha. Hopefully I have time to do two things with you. I want to first go back to last week's Parsha because not only does Rivka get revealed to the servant of Abraham and becomes the wife of Yitzchak at a well, in last week's Parsha we had 3 wells. And so this week's Parsha we have 1 well with 3 flocks. Last week we had 3 wells. And so the Ramban in last week's Parsha wants to let us know why it was so important that there had to be 3 wells. And I hope there'll be time, and then we'll talk a little bit. We'll say something else about the rock, but let's see how we're doing with time. So back to last week's Parsha for just a couple of minutes here. Well, about 10. Okay. However, there is a hidden matter involved here. In other words, just like Reb Levi Yitzchak said this week about this well in the field with the rock on it, that there's something hidden, there's much more to the story than meets the eye. The Ramban said something very similar last week about the story with Yitzchak digging the 3 wells in the area of Gerar near Ashkelon, okay? And near Gaza. And so here's what he's saying. There's a hidden matter involved here since Scripture's purpose is to make known a future matter. Remember I told you this about the Ramban on the first side of the sheet? The Ramban feels every story. In Breshit is a Maaseh Avot, a story about the Avot, which is a Siman Lebanim, which is teaching us, their descendants, something about our fate. Okay. So he says, a well of living water alludes to the house of God, which the children of Yitzchak will build. Oh, so last week he dug a well. He came to one of the wells that Avram had built, or dug, sorry. And then he saw, oh, these bad guys, they filled it in. Let me redig it. He redigs the well. And what does he find? Water, living water, flowing water comes out of the well. Excellent. A fountain of living waters, and now there's a footnote you see from the context of the Ramban's language. It would appear that he interprets the verse as if it's at a fountain of living waters, which the house of the eternal. Okay. He called the first well Asek, contention. Why? Which is an allusion to the first Beit HaMikdash. So now everybody gets it. This week, according to the Ramban, the 3 flocks represent Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. But last week, the 3 wells represent the first Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, and B'meheira v'yameinu b'karav mamish, hopefully the soon-to-be rebuilt third Beit HaMikdash. But he just explains a little bit more before we skip ahead. The first one was called Asek, which is allusion to the first house, the first Beit HaMikdash, the first sanctuary, which was built by Shlomo and destroyed by the Babylonians, concerning which the nations contended with us and instigated quarrels and wars with us until they destroyed it. So in other words, there was basically most of the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, already the bad guys were bothering us. It wasn't a tranquil time for the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And we know that. I mean, we only miraculously were saved from the Assyrians who destroyed the northern kingdom. And finally, the Babylonians came and totally wiped it out. There were a lot of problems during the first Beit HaMikdash. The second well, he called Sitna, enmity. They hate us. a name harsher than the first. This alludes to the second Beit HaMikdash, built by Ezra and Nehemiah in the area around 516 BCE, and of course stood until 70 of the Common Era. The second sanctuary, which was built by the Jews who returned from the Babylonian captivity, and which was destroyed by the Romans, which was indeed been referred to this by very many in the beginning of his reign, they wrote Sitna, hatred, accusation. Thus the same word Sitna appears in connection with the second sanctuary against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. And during the entire existence, our historic enemies during the second period of time, signified in the chapter here by the Philistines, were a source of enmity to us. Okay. That word Sitna was in a letter written by Ezra back to the king of Persia. We're not sure if it was still Cyrus or it was now his son Darius, but it doesn't make any difference. He wrote a letter to the Persian emperor saying, these people around us hate us. And the word Sitna was specifically used in this letter written by Ezra. So we see that the word Sitna, meaning that second well dug by Yitzchak, really does seem to allude to the second Beit HaMikdash built by Ezra. And drove us from the bitter exile. The third well, I'm at the beginning of a line about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines from the bottom of the page in the back. The third well he called Rehovot, and we know, of course, that gave us the name of the city of Rehovot, which was, the Shivat Zion movement, in the late 19th century, knew Tanakh. And so when they wanted to build a nice place for Jews to live, they called it Rehovot, and now it's it's a major source, not of water, but of technology for the whole world. The Weizmann Institute is there. This is a reference to the future Beit HaMikdash, the future house, which will be speedily built in our days. Well, the Ramban wrote that 750 years ago, so we're still waiting. Okay, and it will be done without quarrel and feud. I guess we're not close, because whenever a Jew builds anything in Eretz Yisrael, somebody complains, right? But okay, we're still waiting. And God will enlarge our borders, even as it says, and if the eternal thy God enlarge thy border, he hath sworn, etc., okay, which refers to the future Beit HaMikdash, the future Eretz Yisrael. And concerning the third house, the future is written broader in Hebrew, Verachava, from the same root as the name Rehovot. So we see that this week, the well, according to the Ramban, is the Beit HaMikdash and the source of spirituality and Torah for the world. But that was already true last week. So the well analogy just goes on and on and on. However, there's also the Evan idea. And I should have put this on the page, and I was, I should have put it on later last night, and I apologize that I didn't. There's in this week's Torah reading, it's hard to hide from the fact that one of the major, if not the major, metaphor is stone. You think, oh, we've got the ladder, oh, we've got the well, but in both stories, we've got the stone. That when Yaakov Avinu goes to sleep, it says he takes from a stone of the place. Now, the Midrash says he takes from the stones the place, and they join together to become one stone. That's not pshat, but it's a nice Midrash. Okay, really, it says it really means he took one stone from many stones in the area. Okay, and then in the next morning, he took that stone upon which he slept, or next to which he slept, and he stands it up as a matzeva, as a monument. Okay, so we've got that famous image is together with a stone, and then we have our image of the well and the 3 flocks and the big stone. So the question comes up, what really is the image of the stone? And so the fact of the matter is, Yaakov eventually identifies himself with the stone. Now, how do I know that? Because when you look at the bracha that he gives to his most beloved son, which of course was Yosef, even though the bracha he gives to Yehuda is a very powerful bracha, but the most loving blessing does indeed go to Yosef. And in that, it says he calls him Even Yisrael. He calls his son, he calls his son Even Yisrael, that Yosef will be the rock of Israel, the stone of Israel. So what do we mean by this? So the fact of the matter is, here in Eretz Yisrael, Even is the building material. I know in other countries, it might be reinforced concrete, or it might be mud bricks, or it might be something else. But here in Eretz Yisrael, building material is stone. And that's what David HaMelech was saying when he said, Even moasu habonim hayatala rosh bina, that a stone which the builders rejected because they thought it might be deformed or weak, becomes the cornerstone, the keystone of, of the future building of the world. And of course, that stone that we believe that gets rejected by the world, but ultimately is the fundamental fulcrum upon which the world really rises and develops, is the Jewish people. And that's Even Yisrael. And so the Bechor Shur, who again is one of the Bali Tosfot, and wrote in the 13th into the 14th centuries, asked the same question. He says, what does the word Even represent? He says something beautiful. He says, Even ze av midubak leben. And the word Even means av, connected, midubak, glued, attached to the son. Av and ben together. That's what the word means. The true building is called what a father, what a parent gives over to the child. So Oz, he says, Ha'even Yisrael, he ha'hemshech shel adorot av leben la'ad. So he says that the stone of Israel, which is what he titled his son. Remember, he's got all of these experiences with stones, both at the ladder and at the well, okay? When he leaves home and meets beloved Rachel, in both cases, he says the stone of Israel is the continuity of the generations, parent to child, forever. So that's what's going on in our tableau. Think back to the scene. Imagine it in your mind. You've got 3 flocks, beautiful field. In the middle of this field is a well with a massive stone over it. So you've got the image of the well, which is the source of life and spirituality. And on top of it is the rock, which represents the continuity of the Jewish people, which is the building block for all of human civilization. And that's what's going on here. The well is Torah and God's largesse and the Beit HaMikdash, all of that. The rock is us. We are the rock. And what makes us the rock, the building material and the continuity material to keep the Jewish people and all of humanity and all of civilization going is that ability of parent to connect to child to keep the chain, the Masorah, going on forever. And those are the images that when you look at that beautiful scene, you're supposed to really imagine, in your mind and in your soul. And I just think that these ideas are very, very powerful. And that when we read, these stories, they're beautiful stories. I love the love story. I was talking this afternoon to Rivka about, how the rabbis get embarrassed because Yaakov got up and kissed Rachel, and he just fell in love at first sight, and it's very, very romantic. And then the rabbis do everything they can to de-romanticize it. But nevertheless, these images are supposed to be indelibly etched in our psyche to remind us of what things in this world are really important. And there are two: getting material of spirituality from God, whether it's Torah, the Beit HaMikdash, and making sure that divine largesse gets given over, deposited into the next generation. So the well is the stuff we want to keep our nation going, and the Evan represents our efforts to keep this building process going ad forever. Okay. A little metaphoric material tonight, but I hope you appreciated it. And I, of course, want to thank everyone for joining tonight. I know a couple of people were away, but that's okay. And I'm really looking forward to 2 weeks from tonight. Will be in the afternoon when I hope we'll get together, and we'll do our best to broadcast that to make sure that those who can't make it will be able to participate. That's number one. Number two, next week I have to send out a new a new code for the Zoom meeting. And so Blinetta on Sunday, when I send out the sheet, I'll send out the new meeting code as well. Okay.
Rabbi, when you make a new meeting, thank you very much. I enjoy your shiur. When you make a new meeting, if you're using your own, when you set up your meeting, if you're using your own personal ID, because it'll just give some random ID. If you use your own personal ID and then give your password, you'll always be able to use the same one, even when you have to repeat it and you have to renew it or whatever it is, like make a new one. If you just keep using, because when you make a meeting that recurs like that, it'll give you an option to go and use your own personal number. Everybody has his own personal number.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you don't have to change it.
I they just told me I can only do it for, they used to say till 7. Right. Now they only let me do it for 6. But
right. So it's easier. It's easier because I know, when I would send out links, I'm wondering, did the person click on this link, and how many times did they mix everybody up? Not to mention myself, but how many times did they mix them up? Yeah.
Oh, if we can keep the same one, I'll try. I'll see if it lets me. Okay.
Yeah. If it's not your own personal number on there, it won't let you. But from now on, then you would be able to use your own personal number. It'll be easier for you too.
Okay. I will. Patty, I'll try. That doesn't mean I'll succeed.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe I'll get my son next Sunday to help me.
But
okay. But thank you for that tip.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
As always, extremely interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you.